Hello there everybody, Sam's Trains here, welcome back to the railway and welcome to a bit of a vintage loco review. Not something I do too often these days, but today I am looking at a vintage steam loco by Rivarossi. Today's loco was actually suggested to me by a viewer, and I'll have to admit I had no idea this model existed. Pretty sure I've never seen one of these before. Now, the person that recommended this to me didn't seem to be much of a fan of it, shall we say that? Yeah, they said it's hideously inaccurate, that I wouldn't like it, and of course that piqued my interest quite a bit. So the model is this. It is a Royal Scot, so a British locomotive made by Rivarossi, who is an Italian manufacturer. And Rivarossi are still around today, of course, although now they're owned by Hornby. So this is a British locomotive, but it is in HO scale, not 00 scale, which suggests that it wasn't created for the British market. I assume then that this was made possibly for the European market, and as a famous steam locomotive over here in Britain, possibly there was demand for an HO scale version of it for Europe. I'm guessing that's what happened. Anyway, this model is quite old, shall we say. It dates back to 1979, which means in just a few years' time this will be 50 years old. Now, the purpose of this review is not to make fun of this model. Yes, it's old, it's probably not going to be the best, but you know, we only get the great models that we get today by standing on the shoulders of giants. However, it will be quite interesting, won't it, to see what a 50-year-old HO scale version of the Royal Scot looks like. And it's always a rare thing for me to find a loco that I've never seen before. So I don't quite know what to expect. The viewer that suggested this said it was shoddy. Is it? Is this horribly outdated and completely inaccurate? Or will it be quite a charming model? No idea, but it's time to find out. Oh, what did I pay for this? Well, I paid £100 for this second-hand on eBay, which is crazy because you can get a second-hand Bachmann Royal Scot for £75, and you know, the Bachmann Royal Scot looks like a Royal Scot, which is a bonus, I think, when you're looking for a model of a Royal Scot. But anyway, let's get this out, let's see what it looks like. So I have to say, just looking at the box, having not even looked at the loco yet, is immensely enjoyable. It's like a little time capsule in itself. So the front of the box, obviously most of this is in Italian, but there is an English section which you might enjoy. It says, when you remove this protective covering, you will be displaying one of the world's finest locomotives. Now, that may very well have been true back in 1979, but now, of course, in 24, that's what would you call it? Oh yes, a lie. But full marks for enthusiasm. And speaking of enthusiasm, if I show you the back of the box, we've got some other locos that were available at the time. I'm not familiar with the electrics, but they've got the big boy here, which of course is still produced today with some upgrades from Hornby. But then we've got some beautiful words at the bottom here. Let me give them a go. Accuratezza, Precisione, and Realissimo. As if it wasn't already abundantly clear that this was made by the Italians. But yeah, again, whether this will all ring true today is another matter. Let me show you the end of the box. So the product code for this is 1348 Locomotiva a Vapore. That means steam locomotive, I guess. It's a 460 Royal Scot. And we've got another flamboyant Italian word at the bottom, Supermodello. Excellent. So, I've never seen a locomotive box promise so much wonder before. So let's experience the inevitable anticlimax that will be the Rivarossi Royal Scot. And I have not seen this before except in the product images. So there it is. Looking quite small, of course, for a Royal Scot. As well it will, because it's HO scale, not 00 scale. And yeah, I mean, to say this is nearly 50 years old, it doesn't look horrible. It also doesn't look much like a Royal Scot. Blimey, the join between the boiler and the firebox looks like my hairline as a schoolboy, or indeed now, actually. But yeah, that's that, isn't it? Right, well, I don't think there's any instructions or anything. There may have been back in the day, but there isn't now. No accessories, nothing like that. It does look like the loco and tender are connected together, so I will lift them as one. What's the weight like? Pretty heavy. I think it might at least compare favourably against a Hornby Royal Scot in terms of weight, but that's probably about it. But anyway, here it is. I can say actually it is elegantly presented. I mean, I will compare this with a more modern Royal Scot loco to show the difference, but yeah, I think in terms of quality it seems really good and sturdy. I do like the way the sort of wheels look. They look relatively fine to say how old this is. Coupling rods, valve gear, that all looks fair at the very least. You can tell though that this is quite a dated model though. Nothing wrong with that because it is of course a dated model, and this hasn't been released recently. This is an old release, so I'm not going to be slating Rivarossi for re-releasing some old garbage or anything like that. No, this is very much a look back in time. But yeah, it is actually quite a charming model. Whether I'll still be saying that when we take a closer look, I'm not too sure, but let's move on and do that now. So coming up, a close look at this loco, but first here's a bit of background on the Royal Scot in real life. The Royal Scot was a class of 70 locomotives introduced to the LMS in 1927 to the design of Henry Fowler. Up until this point, the LMS, like the Midland Railway, had maintained a fleet of smaller engines such as the Midland Compounds or the Claughton class. By the late 1920s, Fowler decided that these were inadequate, and he proposed a brand new compound Pacific Express locomotive. Other departments in the company opposed this suggestion and borrowed a 460 Great Western Castle class for testing purposes. Having proved itself, Fowler's Pacific was rejected and the 460 Royal Scot was born instead. It would take another 6 years before a Pacific design would be approved for the LMS. The class was introduced without testing, and so lots of modifications were made on the fly, but the class eventually became fairly successful. In 1943, all members of the class were rebuilt with new Type 2A boilers, the same one as on the rebuilt Jubilee class. Withdrawal then took place over the early 1960s, and all but 2 examples were scrapped. Neither of the 2 remaining locos are in original condition, as both of them were rebuilt. So there she is, up close and personal for you, the Rivarossi Royal Scot. And I've delved a bit deeper into this one now, and I've actually changed my mind on it. I think this is quite decent. Now, it looks weird, it does look weird, but there are several reasons for that, and I think on the whole they don't really reflect that badly on the model. So first of all, it is HO scale and not 00 scale, so it does look a little bit shrunken compared with the Royal Scots I've seen before in 00. However, that does make this more realistic. The bodywork is now in proportion to the wheels and the gauge of the track, which is more accurate than 00. The other thing that makes it look weird is the fact that there are no smoke deflectors fitted to this. I think most people are familiar with seeing the Royal Scot with the smoke deflectors. However, as a model of the early Royal Scot in kind of as-built condition, it is quite right for the smoke deflectors not to be here on this model because they weren't added until later, so can't fault it for that. And even the really hideously square looking firebox is correct for Royal Scot as built. Later on they were rebuilt and modified, and this was kind of made more elegant looking, but as a model of Royal Scot early on, that is not inaccurate. So actually I think it's a pretty well proportioned model. It's surprisingly good for the 1970s, and in fact I would go further than that and say that it's actually mind-blowingly impressive to say that in just a few years time, 5 years time, this will be 50 years old. In fact, it's got a lot of features that we're only just seeing on new 00 scale models today. So for instance, it's got screw-link couplings pre-fitted to the buffer beam. They're not movable ones or anything, but they are there, which is impressive. Look at these. Do these look like working lamps? I can't tell, but I won't be surprised if we see those illuminate when I power the model. Again, we're only just seeing that in 00 scale today. We've also got etched nameplates. Look at that. Again, this is only something that we're seeing all the time on new locos. This one's a little bit chunky looking. It's a little overscale, I would say, but it's certainly etched and it looks fantastic. And we've also got the tender full plate, which is separately fitted and pivoting. That's another modern feature. So actually, I would say if this turned up in Hornby's railroad range today or something like that, I would say it would look better than a lot of what's in the range currently. it's certainly not too bad. So let's take a look at the decoration and finish. I mean, the finish is kind of plasticky looking. I think we do see better finishes today, but then again, this is an old model. Perhaps it would have been a little bit shinier when it was new. And having said that, the finish definitely isn't too bad. The lining is lovely. We've got lining on the boiler, lining on the running plate, as you can see. And the side of the cab is beautifully lined as well. I mean, this has been done with quite some precision. And the little LMS crest / logo on the side of the cab is a lovely little print. Can't really fault that. And the lining on the steps, all of that looks good. It's a very, very nicely painted logo. Look at the smoke box, for instance. Yeah, can't fault that too much. The level of detail is a little bit on the simpler side, I would say. So the buffers, for instance, while they are separately fitted, they're not sprung or anything. That's fine. They are made of metal though, which is great. The coupling rods and valve gear, I think what is made of metal here looks absolutely fine. Perhaps a little bit chunkier than it would be if it was to scale, but it's not far off. The only thing I'm not keen on are these dark sections here, which appear to be made of a different material. I don't know that they're made of plastic. They still seem like they're made of metal, but they don't match the rest of it, and that kind of looks a little bit of a bodge, doesn't it? But there was valve gear that looked much worse than this back in the day. In terms of the running plate detail, look, we've got the mechanical lubricators. These look perfectly good. Metal reverser rod, separately fitted. That looks fine. Pipework across the boiler over onto the smoke box. And look at this. This looks easily as good as on Hornby's Royal Scot these days. Very, very impressive. And we've got wire handrails, which are not too chunky. And we've also got details such as the handrail on the front of the smoke box door, as well as a little lamp bracket up there, although that might be a part of the moulding. Up on top of the model, we've got a bit of a seam line here. I think this is something that we see done better today. Yeah, that's a little bit distracting, and I think the chimney looks a little bit small. I mean, that could be accurate, but I can't find a photo of it looking quite that dinky, so maybe there's a bit of a scaling issue there. Dome on the top, this is a separate part. Again, not a brilliant fit really. We've seen better finessed models than this these days. Safety valves, made of metal, nice little turned parts, that is quality. And I believe the whistle is the same. Again, that is better than many models we see today. One thing that is a bit of a letdown is the cab interior detail though. As you can see, the detail is here and it looks okay, but none of it's painted and we don't have any sort of separate parts there or anything. This was pretty common for the time, but obviously today we get much more detail than that. One thing I love about this model is the tender. This is just so cute looking, isn't it? Quite lovely to see one of these in HO scale. The underframe looks lovely, the lining's pretty good for the time. I suppose the crispness in the moulding around the suspension springs and axle boxes and such, that's not as good as you'd expect to see today, but still it's not terrible, and we do even have a water scoop fitted between the frames. Now the tender is where the motor is housed, unfortunately, and that explains why we've got this relatively tall coal load. Presumably that is to accommodate the motor unit. However, the loco's not tender driven. There is a drive shaft which goes between the loco and tender so that it is the driving wheels that are driven. Not a big fan of this design, and in fact this driving shaft already has popped out of place while I was handling the model, and I've had to take the loco and tender apart and try and get that back in. Obviously these days you'd have the motor in the loco, and that's a much better solution of course. Perhaps the motor in this unit is too large to fit into the loco, and maybe that's why they did it. But either way, we've got a fair bit of detail on the tender, nothing too much to shout about, and we do have this pivoting European style coupling, which of course will not be compatible with British rolling stock, but then again the loco's HO and not 00, so it wouldn't look right with them anyway. But there you have it, that is a close look at the Rivarossi Royal Scot. Much better than expected actually, a lot closer to modern standards than I thought it was going to be. And to say that this is almost 50 years old, that is almost unbelievable really. So we'll test this in just a second. Let's talk about weight. So this weighs in at 366 grams, which is actually more than Hornby's new Black 5 in 00 scale. That's quite embarrassing, isn't it? However, it is a bit less than Hornby's Royal Scot in 00, 5 grams less. But considering this is HO and that is 00, so larger, the weight of this is really quite impressive. So with that, let's see how this runs. I've not done anything to this mechanically. And I don't want to run this too much before I've sort of cleaned it up and perhaps lubricated it a little bit, but I do want to see how this runs straight out of the box without me doing anything to it. So with that, let's get it down onto the track and let's give that a shot. Okay, so she is down onto the track, and this will be the first time I've tested this. I do not know if this is even alive. So, first try, forwards direction, is this going to run? Turning up. Oh. Yep, it is. It runs. Ooh, it sounds a bit grumpy, so I think what my plan is, I'm going to take this apart, show off the mechanism, see what makes it tick. We'll find out together. And as I do it, I'll clean and oil what's necessary to clean and oil, and then I'll bring it back to the track and we'll see how it runs. Forwards direction. It's not as noisy as reverse, so it's obviously, oof, my neck. So it's obviously done a fair bit of running in forwards direction in its life. In terms of the lamps, yep, they are working. They're very, very dim. I assume it's going to be a bulb, isn't it? If this was from 1979, I think it would be a small miracle if they'd put an LED in there, given that they probably didn't exist. So yeah, it's a bulb. You only really see them at full speed, but they are there. This does have working lamps. That's crazy, isn't it? 1979. Okay. So it works. We've seen how it works. I think what needs to be done next before I run this in is the mechanism / servicing section, because I don't want to run this too much just in case it is struggling. And yeah, particularly in reverse, it does sound like it's struggling a little bit. So with that, let's take this apart. Let's see what makes this work. Let's see if the mechanism's any good. Let's see how it compares with more modern locos. And also, I'll see if I can make this run a little bit more quietly. So yeah, it works. Let's go and make some modifications. So yeah, it works. Fingers crossed I'll be able to bring this back to its best. So unlike most models that have the motor in the tender wheels here are actually free to turn. You can also see we've got a sprung centre axle as well, which gives you a flavour of quality, I think. You can see that half of the tender wheels have these sprung brush pickups on the wheels, and I do like this style of pickup. When done properly, I think these pickups are definitely among the best. But like I say, the tender only picks up power from one rail. The loco driving wheels pick up from the other rail, and they have the same design of pickups touching them. And then power is passed back to the tender using this conductive drawbar, which is made of metal. But that does beg the question, how are the lamps on the front powered? Well, the answer is that this drawbar is made up of 3 different layers. The outer 2 layers are metal and conductive, but the inner layer is a plastic insulator, or it's a kind of rubber actually, and that stops the 2 shorting together. So you have actually got a positive and negative passed between the loco and tender using this drawbar, which is cool. The loco does use traction tyres though, and because the loco drivers are picking up power from one side, the 2 traction tyres are both on the same side, which is a little bit imbalanced, but I suppose that was the only way to do it. The base keeper plate is held on with 3 screws, and it is quite easily removable. And look at this, we've got proper turned bearings on the axles. Nearly 50 years ago, and this was a feature on this Rivarossi loco. Amazing. And the gearing is all metal as well. It's geared to the centre axle, and there is a worm drive behind there, which is also made of brass. And here's a closer look at the pickup design. Each pickup is a separate unit which you can very easily pull out. So presumably these were available as spares back in the day, so that if your pickups wear out, you can just swap them very, very easily and you're good to go again. I did decide to remove the base keeper of the tender just because the rest of the mechanism seems to be such quality. I suspected that they might have even put proper bearings on the tender axles as well, given all the weight in the tender because of the motor. Well, no, that's not the case. There's no bearings here on the tender, but otherwise it's a pretty similar design to the loco. Okay, so this is what the tender looks like inside. You've got the standard Rivarossi 3-pole motor, which doesn't have a flywheel, unfortunately. But the interesting thing about this is the drive shaft is not coupled directly to the motor shaft. There is a gearbox here as well. Now, it's not a worm drive or anything, it's just your regular gear. but that allows the drive shaft to be down at the bottom of the model rather than level with the motor, where it would be too high up. So a very, very interesting design. So there you have it. It's quite bare bones. There's no DCC socket or anything because DCC just hadn't been thought of back then. And I wouldn't like to try and chip one of these either. It would be quite awkward to interrupt the current connections and insert a decoder between them. Yeah, rather you than me on that one. But there we go, that's that. And of course, during this disassembly, I did a full service of the loco. I cleaned the bearings, I oiled everything, gave the motor a bit of lubrication. So I do feel that it's safe now to give this loco a run. So is it running any better now? Let's see. Backwards to start with. And it is still a little noisy actually. Possibly not quite as much, but that is motor noise, isn't it? And I just think that design of motor naturally is quite noisy. So while it's not as bad, it's still a noisy one. And I don't think any amount of fettling and lubrication is going to quieten that down. It's just inherent, I think, in that type of motor. But yeah, it seems okay. It's running nice and smoothly. And it's good to know that there's nothing kind of binding up on the inside now that I've checked it over. Let me show you what it looks like at half speed then, half power, 50%. There you go. And full speed, this is going to be loud. Yeah, very loud. There you go. So, good range of speed so far, but what is the crawl like? And I have just been trying this off camera, so brace yourselves, it's not going to be that great. Here we go. I'll turn it up gradually. Oh, yeah, it does that. It kind of takes out the slack with a sudden jolt, and then you've got quite a way to turn it before it goes properly. It did just start. I think it's stalled now. Oh no, maybe not. I am still turning it though. I have a feeling it's gonna, yeah, take off. Right, let's try it backwards. And to say it was noisier in reverse, it does seem to be able to go slightly slower in reverse. But what happens is it goes, and then I try and slow it down into a crawl, and it just slows down and stops. So unfortunately, this is about as slow as it can go. And even there, it's stopping. A bit more. So yeah, it's really not a crawler. But it is possible that this did not run like this back in 1979. I actually wonder whether the magnets in the motor might have lost a bit of their magnetism over time. I didn't open up the motor, so I haven't been able to test that, but it does seem to be running quite warm. The tender body is a little bit on the warm side. It could be that the motor is not at its best. So if you remember these models from back in the day, is this performance typical of this design, or have you known them run better than this? I'd be interested to know. But anyway, let's get this going around the track. I am going to couple it up to some coaches. So I've got some LMS coaches set up, 00 scale, of course, and I've got a little HO scale converter car there, so that this loco with its European coupling can couple up to my British 00 rolling stock. So with that, let's back up and let's see what happens. I'll be interested to see how it gets on with a load. Okay. Ooh, did I stop that in the right place? Oh, not quite. I was going to say this is not going to be easy to do precisely, and I thought I'd just done it perfectly first time. Let's try again. Oh, blooming heck. That's a passenger injuring acceleration right there. Alright, now we've got it. Okay. So the other thing that makes me think the motor might not be in the best shape in this loco is the lack of torque. And I'm expecting that to become apparent when I start this up hauling coaches. Now, I'm not going to do the finger in front of the buffers test because this has got 2 traction tyres on it. The motor is getting a little bit warm with the running I've already done. I don't want to push my luck before I've finished filming, but hopefully with it coupled up to these coaches, I will be able to clearly demonstrate the lack of torque. So here we go, at half power, 50% speed. And on the straight and the flat, it is doing it for the moment. And on the middle line, I've got another Royal Scot to show. This is the modern Hornby one. which is admittedly a much, much better model, but then that's what you'd expect because this was designed about 30 years later. But yeah, it is much better, particularly where performance is concerned. And yeah, this one really can do the slow speeds pretty well. And that's got just a few coaches. And then on the inside line, we have a Royal Scot that is from the same kind of era. I don't know the year offhand, but I believe 1970s, 1980s. This came out around that sort of time. It's a mainline Royal Scot, and everybody talks about how great mainline was for the time. And I have to say, the Rivarossi one makes this look particularly coarse and toy-like, which is a testament to Rivarossi really, because this stuff was great back in the day. And of course, if you wanted 00 and not HO, this is what you'd be getting. So if you're in the UK and you wanted a good Royal Scot, I think this would be the one for you. But it's not as good as the Rivarossi one, I've got to say that. And it still works. And that too has some coaches. Okay, here we go. Rivarossi Gordon's Hill hauling test with coaches. Not slowing down yet. Oh, slowing down now. Yeah, it didn't like that curve. It's still going though. Is it going to stop? It's not stopped yet. So it got away with the curves. It has gotten away with the curves. It slowed down horrifyingly, but it's still going for now. Will it finish the job? Slowing down even more now that it's getting towards the top. Oh, I don't know if it's going to do it. It is, but it's not pleasant viewing, shall we say. It's a bit like watching a torture. It's doing it though. But what I think I'd need to do is turn this up to about 60, because that is going to burn it out, ladies and gentlemen. So let's do that. Alright, so yeah, it's clean, it's lubricated, it's serviced, but I suspect the motor could do with some work doing to it, because yeah, I reckon the magnet might need looking at. And I'll have to try that when I've got a minute, because they're really not fun to access, these motors. The casings are so solid, and you've got to kind of pry them off to get inside. It's not a fun process, but it might be worth a try. But at the very least, this gives you an idea of how these models would run, even though most likely back in 1979 or the early 80s, these would probably have run a little bit better than this. But performance aside, you know, she's an old girl. I think we can forgive her a bit of that. I have to say this model on the whole was not what I was expecting. I thought, this is nearly 50 years old, this is going to pale into absolute atrocity compared with what we've got these days. And actually it really doesn't. I mean, obviously it's dated, obviously it's not as good as what we've got these days, but it's nowhere near as bad as I was expecting it to be, being that this came out in 1979. And, you know, I started this video looking at the box, seeing their wild claims, saying that this was one of the finest locomotives in the world. And honestly, in 1979, thinking about what else was available, particularly from the likes of Hornby, I don't think that's too much of an exaggeration. In 1979, this model must have been absolutely mind-blowing. The detail, the finesse, the quality were miles ahead of what else was available, particularly in British 00. It must have been incredible. And I don't know what this cost back in the day. If anybody knows, please do let me know. I do imagine that it would have been incredibly expensive because, like I say, models of this quality and detail were not commonplace for many, many years later. So this has been an incredibly interesting model to look at today. Not one that I'd really heard of before, and I suppose that makes sense because I'm in Britain and it's HO scale, not 00, so it doesn't fit in with anything over here in the UK. It's too small. But for the European market, this must have been an absolutely amazing model. And I do like the fact that this is HO. It kind of looks proportional, it looks good. A lot of people say, why don't British manufacturers just scrap 00 and start doing HO? Well, yeah, that would be lovely in an ideal world, but realistically, none of them are going to do that because any loco today produced in HO for the British market is not going to fit in with anything else. It won't fit in with rolling stock, it won't fit in with scenery, everything. It's going to look too small next to it all, and that will put modelers off and that will affect sales. No manufacturer wants to do that, so we are stuck with 00, and it's just models like this that give us a taste of what locos would be like if they were done to scale properly in HO. But yeah, a cool model, really enjoyed looking at it. Okay, so just for some fun, I am going to give this ratings. Now, obviously, it's a little bit futile to rate this as I would a modern loco. Obviously, this was made a long time ago. It's not really fair to the engine to rate it alongside the 2024 models, as I'm about to. But I do enjoy comparing older models to what we've got now, because it is fascinating to see how far we've come. So with that, detail, I've given it 3-star. I actually think the level of detail looks great here. It's surprisingly well finessed for 1979, especially when you look at, say, other models produced around there. Yes, by Hornby, but even by the likes of Mainline, whose models were considered to be excellent back in this era. So yeah, the decoration looks really, really good. It's got working lamps on the front end there, that's crazy. Etched nameplate, really good quality feature. Turned metal safety valves, metal whistle. Some of the parts on here look truly wonderful. On the downside, some of the moulded detail looks a little bit coarse. Not all of it, some of the pipework looks wonderful, but some of it's obviously not that modern. Doesn't have a painted cab, the buffers are not sprung, it doesn't have proper screw-link couplings. Lots of small things like that that add up to make this look more old-fashioned, but overall it's still a good, easy, middle-of-the-road score, I would say. Performance really is what lets this one down. Now, obviously the motor might not be in the greatest shape here. Possibly back in 1979 this would have run better than it does now, but for now it is just a 1.5 star. Can't crawl, yeah, really can't do the slow speeds. It doesn't have the greatest torque, and that is especially evident when it's hauling coaches. But on the plus side, I suppose it is quite reliable. It doesn't really stop or anything like that. And it is a good smooth run, particularly when running without rolling stock. Overall though, yeah, not a great performer, particularly compared with modern locos. The pulling power was not too bad thanks to its decent weight and rubber traction tyres. It came in at 0.45 newtons or around 27 coaches on straight and level track, although this is limited by the lack of torque. At this kind of load, the wheels were not actually turning, so you couldn't really load it up with 27 coaches. On paper though, that is more than Hornby's modern Royal Scot, although of course that loco does not have traction tyres. Mechanism then, I've given it 2-star. Yeah, there's some good in this mechanism, but overall it doesn't compare favourably with more modern locos. So pickups, it's only got 3 pickups per rail. I don't like the fact that the motor is in the tender. That makes the mechanism needlessly complicated, and it makes the loco awkward to handle as well because it's quite easy to disengage the shaft, not that easy to put it back in again. The motor is not the best either, 3-pole motor, no flywheel, not the greatest performer in the world. It stood the test of time, I'll give it that, but again, compared with modern motors, it's not a patch on them. And of course there's no compatibility here for DCC, and actually it would be quite a tricky one to chip because the way power is passed through this model is quite complicated. So yeah, not the greatest mechanism. The quality though is probably the strongest aspect of this model. I've given it 4-star. Yeah, very high quality. The build quality is top notch. It's a very complex model for the time, yet it was put together very well. The paintwork was excellent, and the mechanism quality is good as well in terms of the actual components. What lets this down is the quality of the etched nameplates. Again, this is not a fair comparison, but by modern standards that doesn't look the neatest anymore. And the body construction for the loco and the tender is all plastic. I think a better quality model these days might have a die-cast running plate at the very least, but yeah, it is well built. Value for money then, I actually don't think this was too bad. I paid £100 for this. I think that's perfectly adequate. You know, if this was slightly updated, brought back today, perhaps with a DCC socket and the motor in the loco, this would be worth £100 of anybody's money because it still looks, at the end of the day, really good. So overall then, that is 6.02 out of 10. That is a grade of F, not that surprising. Yeah, it's a very old model, but it's not absolutely terrible, and I was kind of expecting it to be. So into the logbook it goes, and it is 27th place above the B1 and below the Hornby Black 5. So yeah, it's not the greatest, but look, it's on the list and it's not at the bottom. Everything else here in the logbook is much newer than this. The fact that this has been able to rank among them and not miles below them is quite impressive. So overall, this is much better than I expected. Well folks, that will just about do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed taking a look at a slightly more old-fashioned vintage loco. This is not something that I do too often, but it is something that I enjoy to do. So if you've got any suggestions of interesting models from years gone by that I've never looked at and you think would make an interesting video, please do pop them in the comments, and in all seriousness, if I get some good suggestions, I will seek them out and look to make reviews on those, because yeah, this is something I like to do. But for now, that was the Rivarossi Royal Scot. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Alright, cheers folks, you take care.